I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Jonathan Lethem is back with a new book, and we are back in Brooklyn, which I personally, as a reader, am very excited about. I liked The Feral Detective, but I'm really excited to be back in Brooklyn with you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a thrill.
So, Brooklyn crime novel. Okay, we're back on Dean Street.
Yeah.
It's the 70s. We're back with feral children in the city, which I happen to quite like, this whole feral children thing. But the style of this book is a little cinematic. It's a little dreamy. It's sort of shaped out of vignettes. It's a really different kind of reading experience. And I'd really like to start there because I was so taken aback in a way and completely lost in the book. But stylistically, it's a change for you. And so let's start there.
It's very different from anything I've done before. And in a way, what I wanted to do was find my way back into my kind of source code.
Yeah.
with Brooklyn in the 70s and Dean Street and all of that stuff that is amalgamated. I mean, it reappears everywhere, but it's of course handled most directly in that semi-autobiographical novel, The Fortress of Solitude, which, at the time, it was the biggest thing I'd tackled. It was the most intimate thing I'd tackled at the same time. And the way I found my way into my own personal source code then was to think of it in kind of like classical Dickensian Bildungsroman, like coming of age narrative, very romantic in a way. I mean, there's a lot of strangeness in that book and there's a lot that's unconventional, but the book is fundamentally like a David Copperfield it's really a coming of age story. And I wanted to try to reapproach all of that stuff that haunts me. Writing one book did not expunge it, and do it with a completely different kind of toolkit where I took the, poor little Dickensian orphan child in the middle off the table.
Yeah. But also we're using people's nicknames.
Yeah.
No one really has a proper name. So you are carrying through the Dickensian thing a tiny bit. I mean, you could argue with the name thing.
Yeah.
We're playing around. I mean, the millionaire's son and C and, nicknames for parents. And I don't want to say it's hallucinogenic because it's not that, but it's kind of dreamy in a sweet way, even though we're, back in Borum Hill on Dean Street in a moment that's not easy.
It's also 20 years further down the line. And one of the things I love that you call it dreamy. One of the things I felt about it was that it became a book about time and about what it is to remember things and not be able to let go of them, even as they become more shrunken in the rearview mirror and harder to explain to other people. When I wrote about Brooklyn in 1999 and 2000 and 2001, I was talking about stuff that was like a physical, local, recent memory for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. Now, my tribe is aging and dispersed. Some people have passed. And the city in that period seems more and more like a surreal, I'm really commemorating something that's for younger readers, especially, I think seems quite impossible. Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to do was just deal with that, just deal with time and memory and the strangeness of its persistence. And so that dreaminess is really about can we reconstruct this scene? Right. Is it even possible?
You have a great line. I'm actually going to quote you for a second because I do love this line. It isn't the novelist's fault, is it, when he recalls or doesn't what seemed important to him or not? And then you follow it with maybe. I mean, and it does, that line comes sort of later in the book, but you're cutting back and forth sort of, here's the early 80s and here's a moment in the aughts, and you are bouncing around. And one of the things I really enjoyed as I was reading this book too is just sort of connecting the threads. I'm like, wait, oh, right, this kid. And it's almost like interconnected stories, except much faster and sort of quick cuts more than anything.
Well,
so,
in a way, it's not interconnected stories because they're not stories. They're
right. No. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's not the best metaphor.
I understand. You're reaching for something because it's a really strange form. And I don't claim to be some sort of maestro who invented something at the outset. I really didn't know what I was doing. I just needed to write down this stuff, and I needed to, and then I needed to put it together like a puzzle. And I spent so much time on my hands and knees on the floor looking at three by five cards. Once I started to generate these pieces of memory and start to see how they actually function together. So I mean, I like the form of interconnected stories. I believe in it. I see people write it. I've never done a book that way myself, but I sometimes think about doing it. But I would say this is something else. It's almost like a hologram. Like I've got these glinting pieces of memory, and they've been thrown up into a space where they all refract one against the other. And if you trust it or walk around it like a hologram, you can actually see that it's one giant thing. But it also is always threatening to dissolve into fragments.
I like both pieces, though. I like the fragments on their own as I'm reading through them. But by the end of the book, and it has a really satisfying ending, too. I wasn't quite sure where we were going with the ending. I was like, okay. But it kind of sits as two disparate, the fragments, as you said, and this overarching portrait of this community and this time and all of these kids. And it's kind of trippy that you were able to do both at once. And you also haven't lived in New York for a minute. You've been out on the West Coast.
I've been teaching at Pomona College for 13 years. And so this is my second stint as a Californian. I lived in the Bay Area in my 20s, which is why my very first novels are all set in the Bay Area, like Gun with Occasional Music and Amnesia Moon. But I go back and I touch the ground regularly. But I also, in a way, I think I thrive on this distance because I'm always dreaming my way back and trying to reconstruct it like a kind of diorama in my head. And anyway, this is a book about the past. I mean, the present appears, but the characters in this book, and I think they're even open about it, are sort of baffled by the present. They see the past so powerfully when they walk down the streets of Gowanus and Borum Hill that they can't really work out what the present means because the past is still so thick on the ground for them.
It's your 13th novel. I was doing the math. 24th book, 13th novel. And even though there's a little bit that popped for me when I was thinking about what it felt like to read The Fortress of Solitude 20 years ago, which is a horrifying number, excuse me. Like I cannot believe it's been 20 years since that book.
Yeah, I know.
But it's wild to see the evolution of you versus sort of the evolution of this place that I sort of feel like I have a land. I mean, granted, okay, I live in New York and I do, like, I can hop on the subway and be out on Dean Street in no time. But in terms of a literary landscape, right? Like I'm sitting here with Brooklyn crime novel and I'm thinking about Paula Fox and Desperate Characters.
Yeah.
And if you haven't read that novel, I am going to say, go out. It's tiny. It's very quick. You'll read
Beautiful
it.
Book. Beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Yeah. And I'm sure I read it, so it had a moment where it popped again, probably 10, 15 years ago, maybe longer.
I'm going to guess that itself is
maybe 20,
close to 20 years ago now. That rediscovery of Paula Fox.
That's when I came to her. But this idea that you can capture a place that is constantly changing, and you really do it though. You really grab this moment, right? It's like watching New York in 70s film, right? Like Serpico. Mean Streets, all of this. Like there's that moment in New York where you're like, oh, they kind of did it in American Gangster. Like they recreated that sort of 70s gritty feel.
Yeah, but it's really still not the same because those
totally not.
Those other films you mentioned, what they are accidental documentaries.
Right.
I mean, when they filmed The French Connection or they filmed Serpico or even a lighter film from that time, The Taking of Pelham 123, which is a kind of a goofy thriller, or even a romantic comedy. If you look at The Goodbye Girl or Tootsie, when you have characters in real New York backdrops in that period, late 60s through the 70s, even into the 80s, what you get, and it's spellbinding, you get an accidental documentary about how the city's changed. And that's not the same thing as trying to evoke it intentionally. That's just what it was. And, but, I'm really glad you mentioned these films and also you mentioned Paula Fox, because one of the things that distinguishes this book and its strangeness or dreaminess that you mentioned is that it's so heavily sourced in my going back and finding these kinds of materials that help me believe and help me, in a way, locate in my own body, in my own memories, the feeling of what the city was like back then. And I devoted an enormous amount of attention to just like, but what was it really like? Not trusting my romantic memories, but talking with people, looking at pictures, looking at old newspapers. I mean, I did a tremendous amount of research, not to prove that everything was historically accurate, but to just feel the texture. And I really wanted it to be in that way, almost like a kind of a documentary behind the characters, the same way in those films. You might have an actor, Gene Hackman or Dustin Hoffman or whoever, in the foreground enacting a fictional story, but behind them was something that was like a documentary.
Yeah, I now, because of your New Yorker piece from August, that feels like it started as you were working on this book, and I do want to spend some time. I now have a tab on my browser for Jervis Anderson's work
great.
in the New Yorker. I'm so excited to really dig in there. I know I read his Cornel West profile a really long time ago, and I'm sure I've read his Richard Wright profile at some point. But there's a lot of New York in there that I just really want to spend some time with. But that essay, it's long and gorgeous and complicated. And clearly you spent time with people that you had not seen.
Yeah.
I mean, in some cases you call it out specifically. There's some neighbors that you had not seen in 20 years or even longer in some cases.
Longer. I mean, Tina Davis, the woman who I end with, she and I hadn't seen each other for something like 40 years.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That is so wild. She has a great line in this piece too. But when you were shaping that, right? Because you are working with the facts, right? You're working with your old neighbors and you're working with redlining and gentrification and all of these things. And it was so weird to read that gentrification really wasn't a phrase until the 60s. And it makes perfect sense. And yet, you mean it hasn't always been around?
Yeah. Well, it's even, it was coined in 64, but it wasn't a word that people were using in a familiar sense until really the very end of the 70s. And you don't find it appearing in the New York Times until the early 80s. So it was both a colloquial and an academic term, but it wasn't recognized enough that journalists thought they could use it and expect people to know what they meant.
Did you start with that kind of thought process as you were sitting down are you working on the fiction as you're talking to your former neighbors and doing sort of, I don't want to call it research because it's not quite research, but it is.
Well, this is a great question. And it's really specific to this project. The place, because I'm a novelist and I begin in my senses and my body, and I begin in my dreaminess, what you called the dreaminess of this book, where I start making things up and remembering them at the same time. And I want to express this in narrative terms. Everything for me begins in that expressive impulse. And it isn't that I checked it or I tried to, scratch it out, cancel it, but I did want it to be, in this case with this book, enlivened at every possible level by finding stuff out. If I thought I remembered something, let's go find out what someone else remembers. So I was looking people up all the way through the writing of this novel and saying, does this sound like something that happened, or did it only happen in my head? And it was that process of recapturing a community that I was doing in some respects, in literal terms. I was locating people I hadn't spoken with in years that pointed me towards writing this nonfiction piece that followed the novel. But the writing of that essay completely is it's an afterbirth, basically. It's like the process of writing which was a combination of research and invention and conflation and that process was so compelling to me that I sort of couldn't stop even after I had it. I had as much as I needed. So the essay reflects like the impossibility of stopping. Like I still wanted to know more. And it led, and then in particular, the Jervis Anderson essay made me think, well, wait a minute, I'm the only person who knows these people who he interviewed and can kind of corral them again and mediate. You start to feel like as you get older, this is just a novelist's issue. This is anyone who's blessed with a longer life and as, and memories that are important to them and connections and people that you can still, compare notes with. You start to feel like you're building a bridge into the past that's made up of only the elements that you can, construct, and that only you can walk across that bridge.
It also feels like there are three different pieces of that bridge, though. There's the memory piece, there's the nostalgia piece, and then there's this legacy is what I've been sort of referring to it in my own notes for this show, for want of a better word, because there's an overlap, obviously, between the idea of creating a legacy and also having nostalgia for a moment kind of thing. But I do feel like they're three separate concepts. And your relationship with time is a little different for each of them. Certainly your relationship to people for each of those is different. And I was sort of wondering if you were ever going to sort of trip into nostalgia, and somehow you don't do it in this book. I never felt like you were tripping. I just always felt like you were sitting with this idea of, memory. And then there were characters that were just constantly thinking about legacy and what everything sort of meant to them. And nostalgia is something that I'm not particularly fond of.
I'm pretty suspicious of it. I'm feeling gratified that you are making this distinction, because for me, it was the battle continuously to make sure that as much as I'm situated in these desires for the past, desires to understand it, and sometimes desires to recapture it or even re-enter it, that be distinguished from nostalgia, which for me is like fundamentally has a kind of falsification, self-gratification that goes into it. And I needed to know that I was resisting it. And I that when you talk about the book sometimes saying maybe or just catching itself, part of the way I constructed this book, because it's made of so many disparate pieces, was to let the voice be the inquiry is the commanding, overarching. The momentum comes from this desire to understand. It's really a book that's it's like an essay film or something. There's this urgency to just figure something out, and supporting that desire is the sense that if I drift into nostalgia or kind of sentimentality, or into too much narrative, too much storytelling, that I'll probably blow the inquiry. And the inquiry was actually more important. So this is also a book that's suspicious about, not just about nostalgia, but about the power of storytelling itself, which, it's something I'm intoxicated by. Obviously, I love it, but I had to be careful. I had to resist it.
So then, Brooklyn crime novel, does this start with this idea of inquiry and sort of questioning storytelling? Is that what drove it, or was it really the time and the place and the characters and sort of that moment when you're talking about sort of sitting in the expression of it all, right? Like, where does this book start for you? I mean, obviously you've been walking around with this in the back of your brain for a while. Like, just, it's clear that you're doing so much here that you have been thinking about this for more than a minute, but you do at some point have to sit down and say, okay, where do I begin?
Yeah, what do I do? Well, I can tell you a story that's it's probably worth the telling. And that is, so I mean, to begin with, I wrote Fortress of Solitude. It was published 20 years ago. The writing was finished, that's to say, even longer than 20 years ago. And at the time, it was the largest effort of my life. It meant the most to me of anything I'd written. And it felt not just exhaustive, but exhausting. And people would say, wow, this is a great vein of discovery for you. You're writing about the past and you're writing about yourself, and it's also different. Are you going to write about Brooklyn more? And my immediate instinctive response was, no way. Sure, I can see areas of incompleteness or frustration that are a residue of this attempt because the subject is so big, but I just said everything I could think to say, and I'm done. And in fact, I didn't really write about Brooklyn directly for 20 years. So that feeling lasted a long time. That Fortress of Solitude was like an exhaustive take. But halfway through that 20-year journey, it was turned into it was adapted as a piece of musical theater in New York City at the public theater by these beautiful theater artists. A songwriter who's sadly subsequently died, named Michael Friedman, who was a genius, and the theater director Daniel Auken. And they put together a vision of Fortress of Solitude as a theatrical piece that did two things. It took the book away from me, which was great. I was like, it's yours now. It's another, especially because, I don't even really know how to think about musical theater. I've seen only a few musicals in my life, and I certainly didn't feel like I could help them figure out how to do it. I was just like I was rendered helpless. I was just a witness. And that was sort of great. And it was also very moving when I saw the result. I sat in the audience, and here was this material that was so personal to me, but it had been, because musical theater is fundamentally kind of allegorical or metaphorical. It's not a literal form. When people break into song, they're translating emotion into another register. And it handed my own childhood material back to me in this really unrecognizable but deeply moving form. So I was really amazed by it, and it made me think about the street and the people on it differently, to see them in a way enacted by these humans. It's like theater is people in space. And then weirdly, they put me on stage for a talk back, and I first thing I did was what I just did with you. I kind of disavowed. I said, well, that was amazing, but it wasn't my work. That was just like their thing. And I'm just a grateful, helpless admirer of it. But then someone said the question that I, at that point, still got quite a lot, which is, are you going to write about this place again? And I had a different answer, although the answer I thought initially was a joke. I said, well, if I ever were to write about Dean Street again, the only way I could do it would be to take the point of view of someone who grew up in a place where someone wrote a novel about it that was adapted into a theater piece. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the theater piece went to Broadway and became giant, like Cats or Rent, and then everyone saw it, and everyone was like, "Oh, you grew up on the Cats Street," and this person who grew up there hates the book, hates the fame, hates the theater piece, and is like, "I'm going to set the record straight. I'm going to friggin' fix that." So the only way I could write another version of this material would be to write against the Fortress of Solitude, even though I'm very proud of it, to write as if the person writing it thought that it was pathetic and corny and sentimental, and also told specific lies, about specific people, even though, of course, those are characters in a book. The person who takes it really personally. And that, weirdly, that joke that I made on stage in that talkback became the seed of this intention to go back and do it with this merciless passion for justice and truth. I'm going to fix it.
Yeah, I also felt like there was enough energy, though. And this is also, when you're talking about teenage boys, I mean, I say this as someone who's very fond of my brother. But teenage boys, y'all are your own kind of tribe. You really and that teenage boy energy, especially baby nerd teenage boy energy like Miles and Dylan have in Fortress, certainly comes through with, I fondly think of them as sort of the feral boys of Dean Street from Brooklyn crime novel. That sort of figuring out where you are in the world and what things actually mean, and, making sure that you have mugging money. And all of these things where these boys and their, classically coming of age, I suppose you could call it. But it's fun watching these kids puzzle their way through. And I think certainly, I don't think the feral boys on Dean Street in Brooklyn Crime Story would turn away the idea of having superpowers. They just don't quite have.
They'd take them in a hot minute.
Yeah, right.
But I denied them. There's no ring this time around.
No ring. But
yeah. But they do have the same kind of cultural materials.
Yeah.
And in both cases, they're assembling their sense of self and their sense of the world out of like this incredibly crazy, unedited, stratum of cultural stuff. Signals, basically. They're like the graffiti, the songs on the radio, the magazines, heavy metal magazine, whatever it might be. They're just grabbing stuff and they're like, okay, this is it. This is me. This works. And it might only work for 10 minutes, but it's like, it'll do.
Well, and there's also the whole sort of the hierarchy too, like who's willing to play what sounded like Risk and board games like that that are very complicated and sort of the precursors to Dungeons and Dragons, where, you get these packs of boys sitting very intently trying to recreate, these very famous campaigns and whatnot. But, who falls in what piece?
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to write about class. It's an interesting way to write about access. It's an interesting way to write about race and integration. I mean, the 70s, people forget that the 70s were still kind of like shockingly weird for a lot of people,
well,
right?
I've come to think of the relationship that we had in that community to the idea of integration as incredibly local and specific. And part of the energy in this book is wanting to explicate that and unpack it, because it's really hard to put in broad terms for people, because it isn't in broad terms. It's like local in time and space. And then that is, there was no dominant community there. It was a total crazy quilt. Secondarily, it was the immediate wake of the idealism of the civil rights movement, and the transmission from all the parents to all the children that something had at least partly just been changed for the better. And we were supposed to reflect that and be the beneficiaries of that. And of course, it was so violently incomplete. Economic injustice and residual racism and deep, deep undercurrents of, unexamined bias and classism, all the things that surrounded this one, yes, it was heroic what the civil rights era accomplished, but this idea that we kids on the street were going to be like the immediate reflection of that and just do like this sort of like kumbaya going forward was so perplexing and so uncomfortable. And yet, I say this now, did we have words for what we were thinking? Absolutely not. But were we enacting it and measuring it and testing it in our behaviors constantly? It was like our childhood there, and I mean this, for everyone, was a kind of laboratory, involuntary laboratory for a collapsing proposition that everything had been fixed. It sounds so ridiculous from this distance now, but I couldn't not try to explain that truth, however uncomfortable it is now to reflect on.
And the difference too, though, we have so much literature that sort of came out of the suburbs, right? The post-World War II, sort of everyone flees to the burbs. And my parents were among the people who left Brooklyn, actually, for the suburbs of Massachusetts. Long story. And I try not to think about it too much because, I mean, I had a very nice life. Please don't misunderstand me. But at the same time, I'm like, Brooklyn Heights, suburbs of Massachusetts. Like suddenly I'm in John Updike and John Cheever territory, right? With no manual.
Yeah.
Like, hi, what just happened here?
I had one friend who moved at the end of 5th grade to White Plains, and I would visit him up there, and we would just walk around. And he was in the school there, and he was trying to explain to me what the new idea was of like being a boy, and how status was established and what mattered. And it was like, now we're into cars. And I was like, what's a car? Like it was so insane. It was an hour out of the city, and it was so different from the streets of Brooklyn that it was like Mars,
Yeah, I'm
voyage
pretty
to Mars.
sure I would not have learned how to drive stick
Yeah.
if we had stayed in Brooklyn. Like, pretty sure that would not have happened.
Yeah.
But this idea, too, of capturing this moment and this community that is so unique in so many ways. And yet, it is finding the details of, the accidental details of your own life and someone else's experience, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is not my experience per se, but like the chaos of the adults. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, there's a lot that it's like, oh, right, there is this universality to what you're doing.
I mean, I think ironically, when I was closer to childhood, when I was in my 30s and I wrote Fortress of Solitude, I expended a lot of emotional energy on identifying with the grown-ups in that book.
Yeah.
I was really trying to give them a fair shake. I was trying to balance it. And in this book, I wrote for the kids.
Yeah.
I wrote all the way inside the kids.
Yeah.
And, there are a lot of reasons, personal and general, that I think that became possible for me, or necessary, both necessary and possible. But I'm not too easy on the parents in Brooklyn Crime Novel.
I think it's totally fair that you're not. I think the parents are more clueless than they know. Like, the parents don't know what they don't know. And the kids, I think we're very quick as a culture to sort of dismiss how much kids notice. They may not necessarily have the language to tell you exactly what's happening, but they know when stuff is not right. Like, they just know instinctively that other people are possibly not like this. Like, this is not how everyone lives and whatnot. But speaking of sort of unconventional backgrounds, you are a professor at Pomona, but you also dropped out of undergrad to write full time. And also, this is the part I love. You said, well, I just wanted to sell books and write novels. And I do want to talk about this for a second, because one of the things I appreciate about your work is that you pull from so many different places. Like, genre is not really a thing for you. That we could get elements of sci-fi, we could get mystery elements, we could get sort of this dreamy high art kind of cinematic experience that we have in Brooklyn Crime Story. But you're also writing afterwards and introductions, and you're everywhere. And it's just this engagement with books and writing. I mean, talk about letting kids fly, right? You hand them a book and they're
that's
just going to go do whatever, right? But I just want to talk about your life as a bookseller, because don't you still have an interest in a store up in Maine?
I do, yeah. Well, so I'm connected to a wonderful rare and antiquarian shop in Maine called Red Gap, and I'm kind of like an emeritus bookseller with Red Gap, and at any given summer when I'm back in range, I do a little bit of scouting for them, and I price a few books, and I play bookseller, but I have my eye on a kind of a retirement bookshop. I want to open another store before. It's always my favorite thing was to open a store. In my life as a bookseller, I worked at 7 or 8 different used bookstores, maybe counting Red Gap, maybe 8 or 9. Okay. But a couple of times I got to be involved in building and opening.
It's great.
Shop.
It's really great.
So I want to give, that's my graduation gift to myself when I stop being a professor, I think, is I'm going to open one more. And it'll be pretty eccentric, and I'll sell a lot of the books I've collected personally over the years that, I don't want my kids to have to deal with these cartons at storage. So, but in between, I also like that you connect it implicitly to the way I expend a lot of energy, that's, arguably could be diverted into a novel or short stories, but on introductions and afterwards, and even some editorial projects, because I think that kind of curation stuff is, or like book DJing is kind of related to it's filling the gap where my bookselling used to be. Yeah. It's like, I want to put things in people's hands and talk with them about it. And so writing an introduction or an afterword, or compiling a collection of, Robert Sheckley's stories or something, that can be kind of like being at the counter of a good bookstore where people are hanging out and they're like, well, what's this? And you're like, oh, let me tell you about that. Or, or they're like, I need something new. And you're like, I think you might dig this. It's that curatorial muscle.
Curatorial muscle, certainly, but also that serendipity, that sense of serendipity and joy. Even if I'm just thinking of some moments in, say, The Feral Detective, where I was like, oh, wasn't expecting that. But there is connecting a person with the book that they need, that they may not know they need it, or just the right book at the right time.
It's like being an herbalist or something.
Yeah.
Books as medicine or intervention.
Do you have a story, though, about finding the book, say, when you were working full-time as an antiquarian bookseller, where you were just like, I cannot believe I found this thing, and I cannot believe I'm going to be able to sell it to whoever needs it, kind of thing? I mean, is there a moment like that? Or
you mean something I already knew the value of, and I was like, I can't believe this copy is in my hands at the time.
A little bit of a white whale kind of moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you accumulate all kinds of moments like that, and some of them are selfish. There's the book that you're just like, I always wanted to own one of those.
Right.
Somebody just walked in with a moldy box of books that they pulled out of their attic, and it's all worthless. And then at the bottom, there's the hardcover of Crying of Lot 49, and you give them $5 for it, and it lives in your house forever after that.
And it's not the Book of the Month Club edition.
No, right. It's the book. A little tattered, but I kind of like putting those plastic wrappers on tattered dust jackets. They almost look better when there's some like wear and tear trapped behind the plastic. It's like the age is trapped in there, Well,
and occasionally too, I've needed to buy copies of things that I had previously owned or might be in a box in Massachusetts. The bookseller's lament. It might be in a box somewhere. It is simply not at hand. And, things go out of print, and occasionally you end up buying something. I prefer if a book is currently available. I like writers to get paid, so I only buy used things when it's out of print, but that's me.
Well, they're also the books I buy every time I see them, because I always want to give it to someone else. So exactly. Accumulating them, and what's really cool is, every once in a while, one of those books will suddenly be available again. Like there was about 15 years where I would buy any copy of Don Carpenter's Hard Rain Falling that I could find. Because I wanted to hand it personally to people. And I was like, this is one of the great American prison novels, and no one knows it exists, and you've got to read it. And I wanted to be able to, I like to own books, and I like to give books away. I don't like to loan books because it creates this anxiety on both sides. Yeah. Will I return it? Will it be returned? So when I want to give away a copy of a book, I want to say, it's yours now.
Yeah.
So I would buy every copy of Don Carpenter's book that I could find. And then New York Review of Books brought it out. Suddenly there's this beautiful hardcover. I mean, a beautiful paperback in that series with the nice acid-free pages and a new introduction. And I'm like vindicated for one thing. I'm like, yeah, see, it was good.
I bought a copy of the New York Review of Books edition of Flaubert and Bovary, the Francis Stiegemüller, because I had my dad's old copy and it smelled really bad because the paper was rotting. And I was like, you know what? You get touched by books and there's kind of no turning back.
Yeah.
There's really no turning back.
One of my fantasy shelves, of course, it could never be assembled. It would be the first edition of every book that NYRB has done in their series. Yeah. Just all together.
That is a very large space.
It would be big, yeah.
And every single time, because as you know, when you live with a lot of books, occasionally you've got to do the thing and cull and
no.
to have new lives.
You have to rent a storage space at that point if you're me.
Well, okay, there's that too, but sometimes you also have to. And every time I go to clear out the New York Review of Books section, I can't do it. I can't do it.
Well, they look so good together.
They look fantastic, and it's kind of my kryptonite. And so often, it's just a weird thing that I've never heard of. A lot of literature and translation for me, being able to connect with the surprise and the serendipity and the discovery. It's such a treat.
Yeah,
it really
I've actually gone out of my way to work NYRB reprints into my syllabus. So I've taught Ackerley's My Dog Tulip in my course on animals, and I teach Butcher's Crossing in my.
I like that better than the one that.
Better than Stoner. I agree.
Do.
It's his masterpiece. It's such a beautiful book. So fierce too. But there is no greater book on the subject of the American fantasy of the frontier,
right?
Than that novel.
And that's the thing. That is the thing. I spend quite a lot of time in California, in Los Angeles, and just the way we still see the American West. I mean, you can go to the Huntington and they still have giant collections of stuff that I grew up seeing in New England. And I'm like, really? Do we have to have this here too?
Yeah.
Hey, can we talk about some of the influences? Because, I mean, I know when you were writing I call it the backgammon novel, but The Blot.
Yeah, it has two titles. That book has...
Right. The UK title is The Blot, and then the American title
is A Gambler's Anatomy.
Okay.
And,
A Gambler's Anatomy.
Yeah, this is funny. One of the running jokes I have with myself, it's not probably as entertaining to anyone else, is I want to do like everything that an author can do at least once.
Right.
So for example, that thing of finishing someone else's unfinished book, I did that once.
Yep.
When I was a kid, I was always fascinated by, it was Graham Greene, I think I noticed it first, with people who had variant titles,
right,
where there was a UK and a US title for the same novel. And I was like, I want that to happen once. And so I turned in that novel to my US publisher, Doubleday, as The Blot, which I still feel is sort of the true title. And they were not into that title at all. And so it got retitled A Gambler's Anatomy, which I made that title up too, and it's fine, it's good, it works. But then when the time came for the UK, I was like, could we revert? How do you feel about The Blot? And they were totally into it. So it's my variant title.
So the variant title, but Graham Greene, obviously you have said that you were rereading a lot of Graham Greene before you wrote
that time. Yeah.
That book. And then also Tolkien was a very big influence on the feral detective. I mean, obviously Chandler too.
Yeah.
But can we talk about some of the influences on Brooklyn Crime Story? Because I'm completely fascinated by the idea of Greene. And again, Greene is one of those authors who sort of perennially lives on, maybe some minor Greenes get culled every now and again, but like the majors never leave. Those never get handed off. But I love the idea that you're pulling from all of these. I mean, you've even talked about how Another Country by Baldwin
that's just
is an influence on
key
Fortress.
Novel for me. Yeah, it was big for Fortress, and it's always with me. That's a very key novel for me.
I mean, the way it opens with Rufus walking through Times Square, and you're just like, oh, I get it. You are right there in that moment.
Yeah.
And it is, I mean,
his ability to capture the city as I actually feel it.
Yep.
I mean, it entered into my body and my bloodstream. I read that book as a teenager, and the way that characters relate in social structures, unconventional social structures within the city, and what it means to them to live in that city, it's enormously congruent with every intuition I ever had about my parents' lives, the life I was making. And so there couldn't be a more foundational novel for me.
All right. So Another Country is part of Brooklyn Crime Novel, but that's not the only thing.
Oh, no. Yeah. No. So I went back to, for some of the craziest parts of this book, like the places where I was doing the sort of semi-hard-boiled mid-century Brooklyn voice. I went back to things like early Gilbert Sorrentino novels, like Steelwork. And of course, Selby, Last Exit to Brooklyn, which is, brutal, painful book. But the voice, the way that vernacular captures the energy of those streets and the lives being lived by people that you just ordinarily, you don't hear their voice. So that was part of it. Things like Selby and Sorrentino, but also documentary sources. I was thinking about what I was learning from old newspapers and trying to capture some of that. And I was also listening to the people I was interviewing a lot and wanting the book to be multivocal and be almost a kind of oral history, which isn't to say that they went into the book as literal characters, but their voices transformed what I was doing. And, and the book has a little bit of a craziness to it because it's irreconcilable. It's holding too many things, too many voices.
I don't know if I call it crazy. It just felt very alive to me on the page. It felt like it was a world that I wanted to puzzle my way through. I wanted to know what happened next. I wanted to be surprised. It's hard to write about a place like Brooklyn the reading experience of Brooklyn Crime Story was really trippy for me in a good way. Very, very trippy in a good way.
I'm glad. That's for me, that's high praise, because I felt I was out on the very edge of what I know how to do as a writer. That adventure, it's a sensation that I'd be lucky to have it another time, before I'm done. It was just every day I was surprising myself with the corners I was turning. It was like a discovery process, or an investigation. So I hope that what you're testifying to will be true for many people, that the sense that something is being, an inquiry is being conducted that doesn't take anything for granted. That's the flavor I wanted to put across.
I think too, it represents an evolution of how we've changed as a society. The language that we've been able to find and the lenses now that we have that frankly we didn't have in the like. There are conversations I can have now with older folks that, I'm sorry, my parents they're very nice people, but like they didn't have the language. And even now, sometimes, but then there are other folks in sort of their age group where I'm like, okay, you're fine. You're evolving with the world right along with everyone else, and sort of watching how people navigate new spaces and new language and just change in general is.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I couldn't have said the things. It wasn't just that I couldn't have known them or understood them. The language didn't exist. This book is on the shoulders of a discourse, really. I mean, that's the academic word. I'm an academic now, so I'll use it. I reached for every new tool that was being invented, just as I needed it. And I was very fortunate to be embarking on this in the situation of the conversation of the last 4 or 5 years. New things became possible almost daily as during the time that I was writing this book.
Does some of that come from your students? I mean,
absolutely.
You're working with undergrads, and
of course, my students, but also my colleagues.
Yeah.
I mean, in conversations that are not always necessarily easy ones, but the sense of commitment to having them, to being in those, we are some godforsaken, involuntary form of community and communal mind. We represent for our students an enterprise of mind, which is that we're involuntary collaborators on the project of like what is the humanities, what is literature today, not yesterday, but today, and what's it worth? And so, those are not always easy conversations, but I'm in them, really. And of course, the book reflects that for sure. Yeah.
Have you started the next thing?
Yeah, sort of. I've got like I've got kind of a document. None of the words in the document will be in the book, right, but it's me thinking and proposing something to myself.
I mean, we've gotten a little spoiled. There have been sort of books every couple of years. Like there's this new sort of pattern of every couple of years, and I was like, okay.
I like to keep working. At the start, I had like 4 novels in 6 years. That to me, growing up, you mentioned Graham Greene, but Patricia Highsmith, Philip K. Dick, the writers I loved most in many ways were often these ones who just, they wanted to leave a shelf, or they were going to leave a shelf behind of. There's so many. Iris Murdoch had a book every other year, and they're big books. And that idea of activity, that you're going to find meaning not in just, sitting still and waiting for this one purpose, but that actually it's the action of things that you think and do that create the most meaning. And I always believe that. Maybe it comes partly from my position as someone who was trained in the visual arts. My dad is a painter. It's like, the meaning is in what's your new show? Paintings on a wall, a gallery full of utterances, one speaking to the next. So I was never going to be content to just kind of say one thing and shut up. I always want to keep going.
I think we can work with that. I do think we can work with that. I'm just curious to see this bouncing back and forth between East Coast and West Coast.
Yeah, well, I
happen to enjoy it. So
you just predicted it. I am definitely going Southern California again.
Okay.
With the next thing. No more vows about Brooklyn, but I'm going to let Brooklyn Crime Novel just be there for the moment.
Yeah, I think it needs some space. I think there are going to be some people who get it immediately, and then there are going to be some people who are like, what did I just read? And I like that kind of dialogue around a book. I happened to have very much enjoyed it. So, obviously I would like more people to be on my side, but we don't know yet. I mean, we're taping this before the book actually pubs, so we're going to find out.
Yeah. Well, the feeling I've always had is that, of course, it's going to be a intense and sometimes disturbing experience for people. It was an intense and often disturbing experience to be the book's maker, but also that it arose in conversation and that it will necessitate conversation, that it's not a kind of closed system where I just drop these tablets from the mountaintop and say, well, you figure it out. But, things like talking about it with you matter inordinately in this case, because it's a book that is kind of open-ended in a way. Not that it doesn't have an ending, but that it's a conversational aspect is continuous.
Although before I let you go, I do have one question about the H.P. Lovecraft basement librry. Is that urban legend? Is that you making it up? What is that exactly?
Oh yeah, no,
I
had some things to substantiate that. I mean, first of all, he did live very unhappily, basically in my neighborhood for a spell, and the awful things he had to say about the experience of being in a multicultural Brooklyn are, some of the most shameful utterances on his track record. But also there was this myth among the used booksellers of Brooklyn that he'd left some papers and that someone had scooped them up. And so now maybe that was an urban legend, but it wasn't my entire invention. It was something that I was working off of. Yeah.
I mean, if anyone's interested, N.K. Jemisin has a duology that kind of takes on Lovecraft in New York, and it's really fun. So, if you haven't read that, I would start there. Is there anything we missed? Is there anything you want to add before I let you go back to,
This is terrific. I love talking with you about it, and I could do it forever. I'm just so pleased by some of the things you said, because it's my wish that this book, like I said, that people want to walk into it with questions and thinking of their own.
I think that's exactly what you're going to get. But Jonathan Lethem, thank you so much. Brooklyn Crime Story is out. And, if somehow you missed Fortress of Solitude, you go back and check that out too. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This was a treat.
I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and the associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am very excited. I am joined with Benjamín Labatut, the author of The Maniac, an incredible new book about, it's about a lot of things. It starts with John von Neumann. It has AI. It has incredible insight into science and madness and splendor and so many other things. You may remember his last book, When We Cease to Understand the World, which was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize and the National Book Award in translation. And so I am very excited to talk about this book today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
I mean, it's hard to start somewhere with this book, right? It's a lot. It's so many things all at once. It is fiction in an interesting sense. It is not what I think many people would picture as a novel. Maybe that's something we need to revisit as a literary community, but I'd love to start with your description of the book, if you'd like.
Oh, that's always very hard to do. Well, it begins with the story of a physicist. It's a tragic story. It's a real-life story of one of Einstein's best friends who, he sort of fell into despair because of several things, not least of which was the rise of Nazism and what was happening with physics at that time, because he was a teacher and he had a very hard time transmitting something that he seemed to think that nobody could understand. He also had depression. So his name was Paul Ehrenfest, and he shot his young boy before killing himself. His boy had Down syndrome. So he had previously rescued him from Germany. The book starts with that, and it's a sort of essay. That text has the shape of an essay, I would say. No, I never like to pin these things down, but the register and the shape and the tone is an essay. And then the main part of the book is dedicated to John von Neumann, who is just a titanic He's a titan of science. It's very hard to pin him down. And that his story just touches on every single aspect of 20th century science. Mathematics, the foundations of mathematics, computation, digital life, hydrodynamics, nuclear weapons, the theory of games and economic behavior. Von Neumann is a bit, in my mind, von Neumann is an example of what advanced artificial intelligence could look like. He was really before him, we didn't have anything close to a computer. He was one of the first, he was the founding fathers of computer science, but his own mind worked like that. So that lets me touch on basically all of my interests, from mathematics to AI, and I tell that in the shape of a choral novel. I guess I would say that it's a chorus where von Neumann is never seen directly because he's too big. He's like a godlike figure, and I think that monsters and gods, you can only see them in their true size when they're seen from afar. It's like you have to get at them by parts because they're just too big to fit inside your head. And then after that, the final part of the book is sort of told like a piece of journalism, because it's mostly, if not all, really fact-based. It's the games that Google's AI, DeepMind's AI, played against the South Korean Go champion Lee Sedol. So the book begins with a 16-year-old boy with Down syndrome shot by his father, and it ends with the most advanced artificial intelligence that we had at the time. It's a sort of story of intelligence. It's a book about, in part, it's a book about intelligence.
And that's simple, right? That's easy to look at. I think that so many times as I was reading this book, I needed to take a moment and stop and think. And often I'm a one-sitting reader, which I truly could not be with the Maniac, because I had to take breaks and to stop and to process and understand, because these concepts, these ideas, these people are larger than life. They're larger than story, than just one moment in time. I think it's really interesting, the piece about you writing around sort of this character of von Neumann, because he cannot be seen directly, because he cannot be understood in that one moment. Was that piece of the story what came to you first? I'm intrigued to know how this all came together. Was there something that showed up first, an interest or a figure?
What usually happens with the things I write is that they're born from research that I do for the previous books. I am fundamentally attracted by what I would call singularities, be they mathematical, physical, personal, those aspects of reality that really nobody understands completely, you know? And to me, certain stories just have a fundamental, essential mystery to them. Incomprehensibility is something that I find extremely attractive. So each one of those stories has a secret heart, which is very hard, difficult to understand. In Paul's case, it's not just the murder of his son. It is also what was happening at the time that he was doing physics. And it has to do with a certain unknowability that matter itself has, right? And that it's very hard if you come close to it. If you come close to these mysteries, it's difficult to remain unchanged. And the way the ideas that Paul becomes obsessed with have to do with irrationality, right? And with irrationality, with the power of what is irrational about ourselves, but also with the certain, Paul is a bit of a prophet, you know? He's a passionate person, and passionate people suffer, and suffering is one of the ways in which we can get a sense of what's coming. I've always felt that sensitivity comes at a high price, but it also gives you a sense of the future. And Paul kind of sees it coming. In the case of von Neumann, it is still difficult. I mean, the people who knew him could only speak to him about him in terms that we usually reserve for mythical figures, right? I mean, his friends would say stuff like, to me, the book began, in a sense, with one phrase from Eugene Wigner, who was a childhood friend of von Neumann. And Wigner said, only he was fully awake. And I am fascinated by anything that has to do with enlightenment, awakening. That's the reason I read, it's the reason I write. And I was just fascinated by this person who couldn't even be, you could compare him to people who were geniuses, considered to be geniuses, and he seemed other, he seemed different. And to me, it was a way to think about the world we're moving into, where, to me, I think von Neumann really left us a part of his mind. And in the final chapter with the games of Go, there are two moves in those games that are kind of miraculous, that have never been played before, that go against everything we thought we knew about the game. So there's always these central mysteries that I'm trying to write around.
And these themes of delusion and madness and greatness and singularity that feel, I think many people would look at, especially the sections on AI or even on sort of political nationalism as represented, this sort of warning, I guess, but it almost seems more of a cyclical notion of mystery and identity more so than just a warning of what's to come, because there's a grandness to all of it, especially in the AI portion, that goes beyond just, so often now we rail against any sort of moving in that direction. People are so anti, I think especially in the literary community, anti-AI, anti-all that. But there is this wonder and magic to it that goes beyond just the initial pang of, no, we don't want that.
I think we're right to be afraid. I think we've been, as a species, sort of haunted by certain dreams throughout all of history. We have this longing for apotheosis. We have a deep, really strange impulse to become gods. We created them. We've fashioned them ourselves in their image. Whether people believe that they were here before us or after us, it doesn't really matter. We've had this sort of relationship with things of great power, of great beauty, and of a terrible beauty, as long as we can think back, right? And now this aspect of technology is suddenly taking these attributes. So one of the ways in which we can think about what's happening now with advanced technology is that we have developed a language to interact with things that are higher, stronger, smarter, more powerful, more dangerous than we are. We've just kind of forgotten that for maybe in the last 100 years. But there is no way that you can avoid feeling awe and terror at something like artificial intelligence. I really think that we need to rediscover and that there is a certain madness to the world, not just to ourselves. And I think that literature is one of the better forms that we have to interact with that. Because to me, the heart of literature is delirium. It's not madness. It's not about going crazy, but it is about possession and delirium and ardor, right? And there's a fever. And that's why I think I'm drawn to these feverish ideas and fevered characters.
When you're researching your works in general and at large, are you finding that you're researching a bunch of things and they're whittled down into how do you structure all of your research? Because between these last two books, I imagine it's been a pretty massive amount of learning and understanding a lot of topics of science and math that maybe don't often find themselves featured in contemporary literature in any sort of significant way. So how do you take those ideas and create?
To quote one of the characters in the book, I really do think that understanding is a sort of, it has a wholeness to it. If you study the Vedas, if you study Buddhist texts, you will have a better understanding of quantum physics than if you just come at it from a sort of purely rational perspective. I dabble in a lot of things, and my esoteric interests are sort of overlaid on these other more scientific concerns. I think the way my research works is that I am not really trying to understand so much as I am trying to find what is still mysterious and to find what makes these things mysterious. I'm not a scientist, so I cannot do science. And that's a bit frustrating. I'm not a mathematician, and I know that there's this entire universe out there that only a gifted few actually get to interact with. And to me, that is just a source of envy that gets me, excited. So my research is really, it's very different when I'm trying to get at the heart of things. And that's very different when you're trying to communicate an idea or trying to kind of I don't want people to understand. I want people to feel excited. I want people to feel, books should be something that you cannot put down and are also afraid to open. And that's difficult. It's difficult to do, you have to necessarily put yourself at risk. You have to put yourself in that state. So it's not so much about reading about the discoveries of quantum mechanics or analyzing the story of the Maniac. It's about being manic. It's about inhabiting the mental space of someone who is considering ideas that will change the history of humanity. So I would say that it's very, my research is as thorough as it needs to be. As it needs to be. But writing is not really about research. And I really hate when writers go on about their research. I mean, I don't know why they're so proud of it, but I don't know. I'm also a magpie. I'm stealing things from everywhere, right? The only thing I feel about research is a gratitude for the people who do the serious work and that let me then thieve around and find ideas.
I think for a lot of readers, they like to hear about research because it's a similar thing to looking at scientists of doing something that maybe you can't do. Not everyone can, go through and write and create the worlds and the, sentences and structures that writers do. And so I think people get a curiosity for how that brain works, just the same as we get curiosities for these genius figures.
Yeah, I wish I could be more honest, because the things that really go into writing, the research part of these books, I would say is a lot more esoteric than people think. They're looking at it's like, yes, of course, there's a lot of ideas there, but I use ideas to point past those ideas to deeper, stranger meanings. And that is the part of research that is actually a lot more exciting. It's using the mechanisms of the unconscious. Literature is a very dark art. It's not something that you can research your way towards a good book. No, not at all. No, that's kind of dead. To find something that is still alive, you have to get your hands dirty. You have to. Writers throughout history have always used the same mechanisms, right? It's really about possession. It's really about giving yourself over. And I don't want to be too romantic about it, but because there is a lot of, right brain or whatever. I don't know what side of the brain does the thinking, but it's you're trying to do both of these two opposing things at the same time.
I think that something that stands separately about your work that I always find is the active engagement that I, as a reader, am allowed to feel when I read. There are some books that you can read and your eyes just glaze over and you just sort of absorb what you absorb. But when I can be in communion with a book that I'm reading, that I can connect with, and that challenges me back, that's where I find that moment in literature. That's, I think, why I read. I want to know everything as a reader. I don't have a lot of time, so I got to try and get it all in one shot. So finding these books that hit all those pieces, that mystery, that magic, that wonder, that I can put something in and get something back, that snaps in your literature, that works so well.
Well, I'm glad you get that experience. I think that all writers, even if they don't like to use this type of language, are very aware that if you do not, by some strange act of magic, capture a little tiny piece of the spirit in your book, it's going to be dead. It won't have life, even if it's a good book, even if it's fascinating, so. To me, this process of writing is really a very strange alchemy. If you do it right, it does at times feel as something that was given. You don't feel complete ownership. You don't feel that way, and it's, to me, it's great, because I used to suffer a lot just trying to find things to write about or ideas to express. And when I changed my focus to observing the world, to just saying, okay, you know what, I'm, just interested in this little part of an equation. It's one term in an equation. How do you write about that? And that was a big change for me, where books were no longer a means of self-expression, right? It was about capturing something of the world. And to me, that is when I started to write and to enjoy writing. But every time you face a new book, at least I try to spend a long time, right, trying to find those ideas that are still alive. Because an idea that becomes flesh to a writer and to a reader is a very rare thing. And even if you're completely agnostic, I know from my own experience that if you become infected by something, if something really digs its claws into you, it's very hard to get it out. It's very hard to get it out. So I try to find, there is a lot of these kind of ghosts haunting the world. You just need to develop a sensitivity, to go after them.
Do you feel like we're losing that in literature? Do you think we're losing that search for those ghosts and for those ideas as we move forward, as people spend time, scrolling through the internet and focusing on so much of what is directly in front of them and no longer looking past into where we've been and where we could go?
I don't like to give condemnations of the state of literature, but I do think that people have come to the point where they don't even believe in the invisible anymore. And to me, it's like, well, you don't have to believe it. It's there. I mean, that's why we've invented science, because I use science because it's the most direct way to prove to people that there is so much about the world that they cannot perceive, that they cannot understand, that goes beyond us. It's a direct reminder. It's not I don't have to convince them, that I don't have to convince them of the obvious fact that we do not inhabit the world, we inhabit our imagination. And our imaginations are delirious landscapes, right? We don't live in the world like a rock lives on the world. But what I do is I use science because it's a very direct showing. It's like, yes, look, there's so much about this. And literature has always been enamored by that. Not only enamored by it, I think books add to this aspect of the world. We are dealing with the invisible. We are dealing with things that are immaterial. The wonderful thing about literature is that it can consider everything. It's like a particle accelerator, but the things that we're accelerating and crashing into each other are the meanings of this world, the meanings that we have either discovered or created. So we can entertain theories that are just downright wrong and that have been misproven. We can engage with the totality of the human experience. And a lot of that is not fact-based. It's just imagination. It's delirious. It's nightmares. It's conspiracy theory. So in that sense, literature can really because it can handle the truth, but it can also handle its opposite. And by mixing those two things, right, we get, to my mind, something that is much closer to our daily experience, to the experience of being alive.
I think that's the allure in many ways of writing and reading about these real people, these real moments in history, these things grounded in what we would consider nonfiction reality. But there's more to that always. There's always an expansion. And to sort of move through that world that you create of, yes, this is based in whatever is historical truth, but science and literature or fiction or whatever, they're not just two sides of the same coin. They're interwoven. I mean, they're both tools that humanity has created to understand the world, just in different ways.
The messy understanding. It reflects the convoluted networks of our brain. We have, of course, it's wonderful that we've developed systems to distinguish fact from fiction, hallucination from perception. But as a writer, you're dealing with all those things mixed together. And that is how we live our daily lives. That is what humanity has to deal with. We have this hallucinatory organ in our brains. It's always guessing. It's always making things up. Things come loaded with so much meaning. And literature is lucky enough that it can deal with all of that, right? There is nothing better than an apocryphal story. It's not true, but it's full of meaning. It is, and that's why they last, and that's why people repeat them. It's because it's a condensation. It's a perfect condensation. And you can say, yes, well, that didn't happen. And it's, of course, it didn't happen that way. But an apocryphal story resists the passage of time because it's so loaded with meaning. It's a trade-off between what we want the world to be like and what the world, what the world is like and what it should be like. Wouldn't it be nice? And that's why people are so, that's why we're addicted to movies, books, everything that has to do with the imagination. And it's wonderful that we can add to the world so much. It's part of our richness. And are people losing that? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's not like I'm immune to it. I'm glued to my phone as well. In writing, you are forced to interact. Writing will inevitably lead you down, roads that you end up quiet. You end up by yourself. You end up having these ecstatic moments. And that can save you from the drudgery for a while.
Because I can never just be reading one thing at one time. As I was going through and reading The Maniac, I was also reading Emily Wilson's new translation of the Iliad. And those huge interactions with the gods and the sort of structure that is never ending and that we see repeated again and again in literature as we go through, it reminds you that this has all been done before and will be done again. And we have these moments, these interactions. I mean, they are interacting with the gods. Back then, we could commune directly. We still knew how. And having that sort of theme shadowing as I was reading these sort of connections with our new gods, technology, it created an interesting blend of, we sometimes forget, but we actually still remember all of the things that we knew before?
Well, we couldn't function. Our brains are built on these symbols. No, we need them. The more you know about them, the more you understand yourself. I am always reading. I'm always writing with God in mind, with gods in mind, with goddesses in mind. You really need them. They're tools. They're absolutely necessary. We're writers, and the people who read, we should be agnostic. We should be unbelieving, and yet we should also have this capacity to inhabit for short periods of time mind states and beliefs that are not rational, that are not sane. And that is it's a source of richness for anybody, whether you're a reader, a writer, an artist. Whatever you do, it's really important that you don't leave out half of the mechanisms of your mind. And we're having to deal with such contradictions. In the book, I really try to bring them together. There is always a religious undertone to these scientific ideas. I'm always trying to wed the language that we used to apply, also because it's becoming necessary, right? I mean, it's very hard to and because it comes out naturally. When AlphaGo won the tournament against Lee Sedol, they gave the machine a certificate that said that it received the highest possible ranking as a Go master for reaching a gameplay close to the territory of divinity. We need these things, and they're coming at us, and so it's kind of unavoidable.
So all of this, I think, has sort of culminated a lot of who you are as a writer and what you do in those aspects. But who are you as a reader? What do you gravitate towards? What do you look for?
I'm a terrible reader, I guess, because I gravitate to the same authors. I'm always coming back, and more so. People like Elliot Weinberger, who I think is an American master, and who will, I am sure, be more and more recognized as someone who did something with the essay form that has opened up a wonderful space, a wonderful marriage of poetry and essay, a use of language, a sensitivity of thought that is, to me, among living writers, quite unparalleled. I also like Pascal Quignard, the French writer, because he illuminates parts of the world that you simply cannot find anywhere else. It's incredible. It's like he was, from another time, inhabiting this present. And he's also a very sensual writer. And that is something that has become quite lost. I find that, letters, they're either too cerebral or they're pornographic, but there's a wonderful sweet spot where something turns you on. It's erotic, it's different. It has to do with beauty and with a certain sordidness. And then there's just the eternal masters for me, people like Sebald, like Borges, like Bolaño, and lesser people who are lesser known. During the pandemic, we lost Roberto Calasso. Roberto Calasso, to me, is just an institution. He is the answer to what books should you take to an island. And then there's writers from Argentina like Juan Forn. Juan Forn hasn't been translated yet, I believe. He created this condensed form because he used to just publish on the back page of a newspaper. And he would just give you these wonderful sketches that felt like magic tricks. You couldn't believe he could do something so beautiful, so profound in so little space. And week after week, he would publish every Friday. And all of Argentina would just be waiting for his text every Friday. Then there's, you can always go on, but I'm looking at the few books that I have around me, and it's always the same authors. And also a lot of, just no fiction, no? Just that's like the rule. No fiction, just please. And no novels. Not even, I would never read my own novel. I just wouldn't do it.
I suppose that makes sense. I think there's a lot of artists of many disciplines who would say never my own work. But I think there's so much value in rereading. I think there's a lot of people I know say, I never watch a movie twice. I never read a book twice. I never go back. And I think, I get that there's always more content, but so many of the favorite works of my life are things that I have read 50, 100, 1,000 times because they become a part of you.
Rereading, to me, is one of the most enjoyable experiences. I watch my favorite movies 8 times, 10 times. I don't care how many times. We should all aspire to create work that actually merits a reread. That's kind of like a basic thing, right? Are you doing something that someone can watch twice? Because it changes your decisions. It really, and also because it takes time. You need to build layers. There is nothing harder than building something with meaning. And that takes time, and it takes giving yourself over, and it takes so much. It's almost a miracle, right? A good book is almost a miracle, and they're very rare. So, and people, I don't know, my editor friends hate me for saying stuff like that, but I would just skip whatever's coming out now, including my book. If it's good enough, you'll hear about it eventually. Maybe, I don't know, 10 years down the line, but we have these tried and true things that have already been discovered. I'm not about what's new. I consume every good movie, but they're very rare. I know that there's so many being made. And with books, it's the same. And for writers, I don't like walking into a bookstore because it's just a daily reminder of how few the words I write will have any value at all. Any value at all. And that is just a reminder that is very hard to deal with because I like to write. And that's kind of it. We produce a lot, a very few of those things have value. And when you find it, just reread the hell out of it.
Is that your message that you want to leave readers with for your works? I always wonder when an author has a new work coming out into the world, that, everyone asks them the same sort of questions of, who do you hope finds it? Or what do you want readers to take away from it? But maybe I'll ask you again in 10, 15 years what you'd like.
I couldn't care less. I don't really worry about that at all. I've been very lucky in the sense that for the last couple of years when I've been writing, I've sort of, in the back of my mind, because of the subject matter, really, you kind of realize, this may be important to somebody out there, right? And I've had experiences. I've met some incredible people thanks to my books in the last couple of years. It's actually been so. I'm very good at contradicting myself because it's been the best part of it all, right? I've met some incredible people. And if that keeps going on, it brings a richness to my life that I never expected to have. But the biggest prize of all, it's always going to be the writing. Not even the book, the publishing, it's already happened, I finished this book years ago now. Years ago, at least the first acceptable draft. So you leave it behind.
Well, I think that readers will find their ways to it, whether it's now, whether it's in 50 years. These themes, these ideas that you surface, this wonder, this awe, people will find it and it will have meaning to them. And I thank you so much for your time today. The Maniac is out now, and I truly can't wait for people to get their hands on it. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jenna.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Topoff. We're going to recommend 2 fantastic books to go with today's special double shot episode. I'm Marc at My Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, but I'm going to have Jamie kick things off. Jamie, go right ahead.
Hi, Marc. I'm Jamie. I'm in Leawood, Kansas. I'm just blown away by where Jonathan Lethem has landed with Brooklyn Crime Novel. What he's done is so hard to classify that there are very few things that are going to compare. But I think I have a great pick for people who really want to read a postmodern novel that is also very human and accessible and relatable. And that's Underworld by Don DeLillo. Giants versus Dodgers and the epic Bobby Thompson home run, the shot heard round the world. And coincidentally, it happened on the same day that the Russians tested a nuclear bomb. And that sets the stage for what is to come, which is this sprawling, all-encompassing novel about life in the second half of the 20th century in America, which is, of course, informed by World War II and the resulting Cold War paranoia. And you get glimpses of every significant cultural moment of all the historical figures and people who were in the ballpark during the game or who were important in the second half of the 20th century. And DeLillo traces the history of the home run ball back through time, which kind of provides this framework for all of these multitudinous flashbacks. And along with that story, he has another linear story in there, which is the story of the troubled marriage. It's hard to describe because it's hard to describe, but this is a genuine feat of storytelling. And if you've read White Noise, you know DeLillo's style is to include all the information. This novel turns up the flame to great effect. It's about everything. It's about art, music, B-52 bombers. Obviously, it's about baseball. It's about garbage and war and the Kennedy assassination and Jedgar, aka J. Edgar Hoover. It's poetic imagery mixed with cutting sarcasm, mixed with surrealism, mixed with the most minute, realistic, detailed descriptions of objects that we consume and things that we consume every day. This is a complex book, and it tops many lists of important American novels. His encyclopedic knowledge of modern concepts and products and conveniences and identities, and the heart and humor embedded in the language he uses to tell his stories they're particular to him, to his talent. It's a daunting project, but if you're up for an absolutely unique and ambitious and intricate read, then I think Underworld by Don DeLillo should definitely be on your radar. Mark.
I would agree. It is fantastic. And you're right. It is a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a tongue twister to even talk about.
It is a rabbit hole deep dive of every topic under the sun. And it's so good. Well, I was going to pick something to go along with The Maniac, which I'm very excited for. It made me think about moments of historical importance that have been fictionalized. It led me to a book that I feel very, very strongly about that came out not too long ago called The New Life by Tom Crew. This is a book that was featured on a previous episode of Poured Over, so please dig into the archives and check this out. It's an episode that also includes the brilliant Colin Tubin. By all means, just listen. So I'll give a small pitch for this. It's a book that takes place in Victorian England and follows two men who each have their own personal stake in promoting a more progressive society, specifically one that has removed the stigma of homosexuals. The two lead characters, we've got John Addington, we have Henry Ellis. They are on an endeavor to create an academic text that sheds light on the lives and troubles of gay men. John and Henry have aspirations for what they call a new life, which is, again, a society of progress where people can live without repression. Of course, in the late 1800s, this kind of work, let alone this kind of conversation, let alone this kind of thought, is very dangerous. This was also around the time that Oscar Wilde was arrested and sentenced for his indecency. So our two heroes walk a very delicate line. John and Henry are based on historical figures who did, in fact, publish the first academic text on homosexuals. Their personal lives and much of the circumstances are beautifully fictionalized and just really infuse the novel with layers and nuance and loveliness. It's a story of hope and fear, of acceptance and shame, and really about how far we've come and how far we still have to go. It's excellent. And I believe a debut and a brilliant one at that. So please check out The New Life by Mr. Tom Crew. But guess what? That's all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. Pretty simple. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Jamie, where can we find you?
You can follow my home store at BN Leawood KS.
All right, that's all we have. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Happy reading. Bye.
Bye, Mark.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.